Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. If you ask a national security leader what keeps them up at night, one of the answers that will come rapidly to the fore is the question of the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Indeed, while the prospect of nuclear weapons maintained a fragile and terrible peace during the Cold War, the prospect of what might happen after the Cold War as nuclear weapons proliferate is one of the things that worries many policymakers. It has also been seen to give perceived impunity to states like Russia that possess nuclear weapons and seek to act in contravention of international norms. Also high on the list of things that will keep a policymaker up at night are other weapons of mass destruction, such as chemical or biological weapons, and the means to deliver them, such as cruise missiles or advanced unmanned systems. Finally, when you add modern technologies such as gene sequencing, semiconductor technologies that are critical to artificial intelligence and other means of making these weapons even more destructive and harder to detect in their deployment, you'd have a pretty good grocery list of terrible things. This week's Horns of a Dilemma is a discussion between Paul Edgar of the Clements Center at the University of Texas and Ann Ganzer, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary within the Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation of the Department of State. Ms. Ganzer's bureau is responsible for the prevention of these terrible things. All of them. Imagine the scope of that portfolio, looking not only at the risks posed by nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, but also by technologies such as semiconductors and how they proliferate, as well as the risks posed by peaceful applications of nuclear power. Ganzer recently spent a week at the University of Texas speaking with students, and in this week's episode of Horns, we listened to Paul Edgar having a great discussion with her, summarizing some of the major issues that were raised during these discussions. This talk was held at the University of Texas, Austin.
I'm Ann Ganzer. I am a member of the Senior Executive Service. I have worked for the State Department for over 30 years. I joined as a Foreign Service officer, but then because of family reasons, left the Foreign Service and moved to the Civil Service. And so I have worked in a variety of functions at the State Department. I've negotiated treaties and agreements. I've met with foreign governments and participated in multilateral meetings. It is a fascinating place to work and a very interesting career, and I'm sure many of your students will find a happy home at the State Department. With regard to my bureau, International Security and Nonproliferation, or ISN, our fundamental mission is to prevent, impede, or where possible, roll back the spread of weapons of mass destruction, that is chemical, biological, nuclear, or radiological, their systems of delivery, which generally means ballistic missiles, but can also mean sophisticated unmanned aerial vehicles, destabilizing conventional weapons, and their related goods and technologies. The related goods and technologies sort of seems like a toss-off, but these days that's sort of central to our mission because the related goods and technologies include things like semiconductors and artificial intelligence and quantum computing. So it's a pretty big scope of effort. Our Bureau has three mutually reinforcing efforts: strengthening the non-proliferation regimes. Your students have been particularly interested in our discussion of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, which is supported and verified by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And we also had some pretty good discussions about the Biological and Toxicological Weapons Convention, or the BWC. We also work with other regimes such as the Missile Technology Control Regime, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, the Australia Group, which is ChemBio, and the Wassenaar Arrangement on Export Controls for Conventional Weapons and related dual-use goods and technologies. Those are all efforts that are led by ISN. We also work to shape the security environment. In that mission, we work to reduce threats by promoting regional security initiatives, strategic stability dialogues. We implement counterproliferation efforts and have standing counterproliferation dialogues with many countries. We vigorously enforce weapons of mass destruction related sanctions, and we use both sanctions and diplomatic outreach to undermine things like destabilizing Russian arms trade, and we work with intelligence partnerships. We also, in this respect, handle civil nuclear affairs, such as work with other countries countries on civil nuclear power plants because of the tie of the nuclear fuel to the IAEA and it making sure that such plants are in conjunction with the peaceful uses pillar of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, the NPT. And then the third part of our mission is counter-threat programming. We have several different program offices that do things like foreign capacity building programs, helping countries improve their export controls, training customs agents on how to spot shipments of concern. We do counter smuggling. We have a foreign consequence management team that is poised and ready to act should there be an incident that needs to be addressed. And we work on global threat reduction and weapons elimination challenges. So that's sort of an overview of what we do.
Let's talk a little bit about the people that work for you, because this is, as I mentioned, this is pretty vast, and you need to be very specific, very precise, often about what you are allowing, what you're prohibiting, what it is that you're even looking at, technologically speaking. What's dangerous technology under what conditions? So you don't just have a number of international relations graduates, right? You have a workforce that has talents across the spectrum. Can you describe that a little bit?
Well, sure. I mean, the State Department needs talented people in a whole variety of disciplines, and ISN is sort of a demonstration in microcosm of that. You talked about international relations students. We have many people who come out of that discipline. I myself majored in communications in college, so I'm not an international relations major. Our bureau has roughly 375 people. We come from the Foreign Service, the Civil Service. We have contractors. We have military detailees. We have scientists. We have fellows from a variety of programs. As you noted, science is key to many of the things we do. We work with scientists, nuclear experts on nuclear matters. I've got microbiologists and others who work on the Biological Weapons Convention. I have scientists from other disciplines who work in the conventional arms area. We have people from all kinds of backgrounds. International relations, clearly, but that's not the defining factor. State needs people from a whole variety of backgrounds, and it all weaves together into the cohesive whole of foreign policy and having, for example, science inform foreign policy. We need people with language skills. We need people with historical knowledge. We need people who are problem solvers. We need project managers. Quite frankly, we also have, particularly in our assistance programs, accountants and finance people who can keep track of the money. So we need everyone.
So let's go ahead and turn to some of the conversations that you've had this week. To me, one of the most interesting events that we've discussed is Russia's recent disinformation campaign, especially with respect to allegations of biological weapons, because it involves, this particular problem involves a combination of things that we have focused our attention on, all telescoped into one issue. So it includes Russia's war against Ukraine, or at least an aspect of that, laboratories for biomedical research that are at least partially funded by the U.S., not for biological weapons, but for other purposes, and disinformation. Can you kind of describe that issue and what your bureau has been doing? I guess go and stop there because I'm not going to say reacting to it, but can you discuss what your bureau has been doing in this area?
Sure. Let me frame this a little. The Biological Weapons Convention is one of the most important international security agreements dedicated to preventing the spread of biological weapons. It has existed for decades, upholding a global norm that biological weapons are repulsive and, in fact, are prohibited. It is the first agreement that was ever negotiated that bans an entire class of weapons. It shows the importance of what we're doing in this area. And this administration is deeply committed to countering the full range of present and future biological threats. I think we all learned from COVID-19 the dangers that we are facing. Let me be clear. COVID-19 was not a biological weapon, and I don't pretend it is. But the COVID-19 pandemic showed us our shared vulnerability to a catastrophic biological event and showed us that we need to work with other countries to ensure that these things don't happen, both in terms of a naturally occurring pandemic, such as COVID-19, but also were there to be a use of a biological weapon. And in fact, the administration believes this is important enough that it announced a U.S. Special Representative to the Biological Weapons Convention, Ambassador Ken Ward. Now, you asked a little bit about Russian disinformation and what we've been doing in this space. Disinformation is one of the Kremlin's most insidious and far-reaching weapons, and they use this regularly. They have become somewhat expert at it. My grandfather used to paraphrase, I believe it was Mark Twain, saying something that a lie is all the way around the world while the truth is still putting its boots on. And that is something that Russia is playing to. In the case of the Biological Weapons Convention, the United States, under the old cooperative threat reduction, when the Soviet Union essentially fell apart, we had the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. We funded laboratories to do biological surveillance, medical research, those kinds of things in many former Soviet Union countries to give the people who had been working on Soviet weapons programs peaceful uses to work on, peaceful jobs. Keep them employed, keep them from selling that weapons knowledge to other countries. The program has been very successful, and we have such labs throughout former countries of the former Soviet Union. I actually worked on that program way back when, and so I take this issue a little personally. You know, the Russians know darn well what those labs were doing because we established some in Russia, but facts didn't mean anything. The Russians accused the United States and Ukraine of cooperating on creating biological weapons in these laboratories, largely because they were funded by the Department of Defense. The Russians have taken this issue to the Security Council a couple of times, and they have also taken it to the Biological Weapons Convention itself. The Biological Weapons Convention has Article 5, which sets out a procedure for a state to accuse another state of development or use of a biological weapon. Now, Russia called for an Article 5 meeting. They did not, in fact, even come up with a whole lot of original information to support their allegation. A lot of what they accused us of was a repeat of things they'd accused us of in Georgia like a decade ago. And quite frankly, we take the BWC very seriously. And so even though we knew these allegations were false, we take seriously the need to address them in the Biological Weapons Convention. So we participated in this Article 5 meeting. Russia, we believe, was abusing the Article 5 process, but Article 5 does allow or call for states parties to consult one another to solve problems. And so in this respect, we participated. Russia made the allegations and requested the Article 5 formal consultative meeting in June, and the meeting happened in August, right? August, yeah. Special Representative Ken Ward represented us in that meeting along with a team of experts. And he effectively exposed Russia's disinformation tactics and their spurious allegations. There were 89 delegations there, and the first day, Russia laid out its case, such as it was. But they also kind of showed their hand because they were circulating among some of their more friendly states a statement saying that the United States and Ukraine had not addressed their allegations before the United States or Ukraine even had an opportunity to talk. So kind of showed their hand, but then the technical experts from the United States and the Ukrainian delegations explained in very clear and unambiguous terms our cooperation and the U.S. assistance and how it was related to public health, health facilities, biosafety, biosecurity, and disease surveillance as part of the broader U.S. Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. We demonstrated that these peaceful efforts, often in partnership with other countries and non-government and international organizations, have strengthened human and animal health and health security, not only in Ukraine, but throughout the region. We also highlighted how these activities are consistent with and support the BWC itself, particularly Article 10, which is the article of the BWC that promotes cooperation and assistance by the states parties. So we affirmed this at that Article 5 meeting, and states parties affirmed and supported the United States in this regard. 35 of the 42 countries that spoke noted the importance of this United States work. So we continue to fulfill our obligations to the Biological Weapons Convention, including by working with partners around the world to strengthen global health security and reduce the impact of infectious diseases on our society. We condemn Russia's ongoing disinformation campaign to try and distract from and justify its unprovoked and brutal war against Ukraine. In fact, one thing that got into the news, Russia, when they couldn't counter our very factual discussions about what we were doing in this space, started to justify its invasions of Ukraine, including some of the falsehood they'd said before, such as that they were aiming to denazify Ukraine. Well, that sort of crossed a red line, and our special representative called the Russians on it and then led the U.S. and Ukrainian delegations in walking out of the meeting in protest. Now, we did not walk out of it completely. We walked out of it for that day and then returned to the negotiating table the next day. But we continue to support biological safety, biological security, peaceful uses of biological technology. We cooperate with countries around the world, helping them do disease surveillance, helping them fight disease, helping them do medical research, securing pathogens, destroying pathogens they don't need, ensuring that their laboratories meet the highest standards of safety and security. This is an important mission, and the United States believes in it, and we will continue to do this, even though Russia will attempt to twist this for its own ends.
So a couple of questions occur to me. You noted the number of countries that came to the United States defense, essentially, when this came to the floor. Is there anywhere this story has gained traction?
You know, it kind of goes back to what I said. If you repeat a lie often enough, some people believe it. I don't think that was very effective in the BWC context. You know, Russia will have a couple of its friends who will seem to promote this. But I was not present at the meeting, but I have heard that at one point, the Russian denunciations of the United States and allegations got to be so absurd that some of the delegates in the room started laughing. So they most definitely, I don't think, convinced anyone. That does not mean that they won't have some of their usual friends supporting their position.
So the other question that occurred to me is that you've worked on a number of these issues, maybe not continually over the course of your career. Sometimes you've worked on an issue, gone to another field, come back to it. But can you discuss perhaps a little bit of your experience of Russia's participation over the past 20 to 30 years since the dissolution of the USSR? And have you seen a difference in their reaction or their activities as perhaps a good partner or an untrustworthy partner, and now actively an adversary in many respects? Has there been a trajectory, or has it been a little bit of hit and miss the whole time? How would you describe it?
That's a challenging question because every country is going to act in its own interests. And there have been times when our interests aligned with Russia, and there are times when it does not. So it's hard to characterize it as cooperative or non-cooperative. I mean, I mentioned the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, or the NPT. In January of this year, the 5 nuclear weapon states, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, United States, Russia, China, France, and the UK, issued a joint statement that brought in shades of Reagan-Gorbachev that a nuclear war cannot be won and should not be fought. We were very pleased and proud with that statement. It was an important statement of what we believed were our shared values. Not even 2 months later, Russia invaded Ukraine. So it shows how things can change quickly. Now, Russia is a member of several of the multilateral export control regimes, the Missile Technology Control Regime, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, the Wassenaar Arrangement. And at times, we have worked very cooperatively with them on developing control lists, items that need to be controlled for export. At times, they have been somewhat obstructionist. Sometimes it is because they have real concerns about whether a technology can or cannot be controlled. Sometimes it's because the state of relations, and so they're just obstructing things because they don't want to give somebody else a win, or they don't want to, Right. So it is very situational. Now, since the invasion of Ukraine, or I have to clarify, the further invasion of Ukraine, because remember, they first invaded Ukraine in 2014 when they went into Crimea. So, but in the further invasion of Ukraine, we have imposed unprecedented sanctions on Russia. We are working to ensure that their military does not have the equipment or the funds it needs to sustain the war effort. We have blocked the export of all kinds of things to Russia, trying to deny it the technology it needs in this sphere. So right now, I would say relations are probably at one of their lows, but we still do sometimes work with them in multilateral arenas where it is necessary.
A related issue, or somewhat related issue, but coming off of disinformation, certainly related though to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or further invasion of Ukraine, as you've said this week. Many of the other questions that students had revolved around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and the consequences of the Russian war against Ukraine relative to that. Can you discuss some of that?
Well, the context in which it came up is some of your students were asking about work-life balance. And sometimes you can have work-life balance at the State Department, and sometimes you can't. I was describing how one night after the invasion, I actually got to go home at a reasonable hour, was thinking about maybe I'd go to bed early, check the news headlines, nuclear power plant in Ukraine on fire. Well, there went my early to bed that night. I went and pulled out my laptop, and we coordinated through the night. Nuclear power is an important carbon-free source of energy, and it is helping us with climate change. But many people continue to be concerned about the impact of a release of nuclear material. And so Zaporizhzhia, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, is currently at the center of some of the activity in Ukraine. Russia has control of the plant, although the Ukrainians are still operating it. And there is frequent shelling and skirmishes in the Zaporizhzhia region. And so it is very much of concern. It is not good to have a nuclear power plant in a war zone. The nuclear reactors themselves are fairly well protected, but they're not designed to withstand, for example, missile strikes. Let's just be clear there. So we are working hard with other partners. We've issued statements with the G7 countries. We are working with the IAEA to ensure that the plant continues to be operated safely, securely, and that IAEA safeguards under the Ukrainian Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement continue. Rafael Grossi, the Director General of the IAEA, has visited the plant. He took a team with him to ensure that the plant was still safe. He left some inspectors behind to ensure that the plant continued to be operated safely and under safeguards. And in fact, recently pulled out the original inspectors, and there's a new team in there because it is, of course, very stressful. I can't even imagine how stressful it is for the Ukrainians themselves that are operating that plant. But it was also incredibly stressful for these third country nationals who were there as IAEA experts to ensure that the plant is being operated safely and securely. So that has been a continual challenge, and it is something we are working on.
To continue in this vein, this war is not about energy directly, but Zaporizhzhia and Russian energy to Western Europe are certainly important sub-themes within the context of the war. So nuclear; these are very contentious sources of energy, and for different reasons, and perhaps for good reasons sometimes, and not good reasons at other times. But nuclear energy and petroleum-based energy or carbon-based energy. How do you see this playing out over the next 5 or 10 years? So there, in one sense, there's going to be a reaction to we've got to develop sources beyond Russia and carbon-based energy, but then we're also nervous about what could happen at a place like Zaporizhzhia. So what do you see?
Well, you sort of threw me a whole lot of issues there. So let me see if I can address them. First and foremost, Zaporizhzhia, as I said, is one of the largest nuclear power plants in the world and is the largest in Europe. And it provided significant energy to Ukraine. And in fact, they exported energy to nearby countries, principally Moldova, but I think others as well. The plant is largely shut down now. It has six reactors, and at the time that it was taken over, only 2 of those reactors were operating, and they have only one has continued to operate sporadically because the Ukrainians, quite frankly, believe they need the energy. They would also like the revenue from those exports, but that would require more operations. Right. We work closely with the Department of Energy on this. The reactors being shut down into cold shutdown is the safest situation as long as the war rages around them, because as the fuel cools down, it would cause less of an incident were there to be a strike and a release. We are all hoping that never happens because nuclear energy is very important to the issue of climate change. And in fact, there are a lot of developments going on in this area. The United States has invested heavily in and is right now working hard to develop what are called small modular reactors, SMRs. SMRs are kind of the future of nuclear energy. They are much smaller, more compact, more sealed, so they will not need, the large standoff distances that a standard nuclear power plant has. And so they can be put closer to cities and things like that. And particularly if we're looking at Eastern Europe, there is a great potential for small modular reactors potentially to replace coal plants that are very polluting. And many countries around the world, not just in Europe, are looking at small modular reactors to help them meet their goals under COP26, a major international climate change conference last year, where many of them talked about how quickly they were going to get to carbon zero, and so a lot of them see nuclear power as the way to get there. For some, they are looking for traditional large nuclear power plants, particularly those that have the greatest energy needs. And the most advanced nuclear power plant in the world right now is the AP1000 made by Westinghouse. But we are also looking at exporting those, but also small modular reactors. In fact, at that COP26 meeting, Romania and a U.S. company, NuScale, signed a deal to build the first-of-a-kind reactor in Romania. So what happens in Zaporizhzhia, while it is very important, could also have an impact on the rest of the nuclear energy industry. Just to not completely ignore, I don't handle the oil and gas issues, so I'm not as up to speed on those. But I think while we all knew that the world heavily relied on Russia for energy resources, I think that its invasion of Ukraine and some of the sanctions, for example, the decision to not complete the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, some of that showed just how reliant the world has become on Russia for energy. And it's also been a sort of wake-up call. People are pulling back on and looking for alternative sources of energy to Russia, both on the oil and gas, but also on the nuclear.
Thank you for that. And if I can toot my own horn on this issue, jokingly, of course, but I brought up the idea of SMRs in Baghdad in 2003, 2004, when we were trying to get more megawatts on the grid there. But I think I was way before my time and was on Ambassador Bremer's staff. Was not taken. My idea was not taken seriously at the time, but I'm glad that we're making progress in that field now, and at least other than Ukraine, in places that are much more better suited for management of this.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.